So you finally went out and bought a DSLR and you've seen other footage online of people using that camera that looks super sick and epic, and you went out and shot with it and you're wondering why the footage just doesn't look that good. Well, it's probably because of a few things, and I'm going to show you guys those today. Alright guys, so the first thing I want to talk about is aperture. Now the aperture is usually written right on the lens. And in this case, this is a 16-35 lens and the aperture is f4. So the aperture is how wide open the lens can get. And the more wide open it can get, the more you can get that blown out background look that people like. The bokeh, the depth of field, you can get that really shallow depth of field. In this case, this is an f4, which is okay. It's not bad. I think if you want something that's a little bit more blown out, maybe you'd want a 2.8 or a 1.8. There's actually a pretty cheap lens that you can get if you're just getting into photography, because these lenses can get really expensive. A lot of people call it the nifty 50. They make one for Sony, for Nikon, and for Canon, and I think all of those lenses are under $200. The lens is usually cheaper construction, and you know, it's just a great beginner lens to kind of start playing around with depth of field. If you're getting into photography and you don't want to spend that much money, go over to Amazon and look for the 50mm 1.8. It's probably under $200. I think the Canon one I had for a while was around $100. So in photography, it's actually pretty easy to get a shallow depth of field. If you set your camera to aperture priority, you set the aperture to 1.8, you're gonna get those excellent shots right out of the camera pretty effortlessly. So with video, it's a little bit different than photography, and you need to keep your shutter speed at double that of your frame rate. So I'm filming this in 24 frames a second. It's real-time video, and in this case, I'd set my shutter speed to 1/50. If you were filming in slow motion at 60 frames a second, you would double that, and you'd need to get the shutter speed as close to 1/120 as possible. The reason that's the case is because basically we want the camera to mimic the amount of motion blur that we see when we look at things with our eyes. When we see things through our eyes, there's a slight amount of movement when our hand passes back and forth really quickly. There's a certain amount of movement that we see there, and when you jack up the shutter speed really high, things start to get a little bit jumpy and it's not really realistic. And if you don't have an ND filter on your camera, then things start to get really jumpy, and that's the effect that you'd get if you shot an aperture priority at, say, 1.8. I imagine your shutter speed would probably go through the roof, 1/8000 or something crazy like that, and then you'd notice that all the movement in your shot would be very jittery and just not look that smooth. I think for most people, they probably wouldn't really care that much, and this is what GoPros do, iPhones do, and I think for like the basic home video or something around the house or just shooting fun stuff of kids, it probably honestly doesn't matter. This technique and some of the stuff I'm telling you guys is how to take your skills to the next level. So if you're filming at that shutter speed of 1/50 and you set the camera to, let's say, f2 or f2.8 or even f1.8, you'll notice that the image is overexposed. Now, that's when something called an ND filter comes in. So this is an ND filter, and this is a variable one. And basically when I spin this element in front, it'll get lighter and darker. Now, what this is basically a sunglass for the lens. If I take off the cap and I screw this on the front, they're basically sunglasses, because in order to shoot at 1/50 at 24 frames a second and something as wide open as f2 or f2.8, it's going to be letting a lot of light into the camera, which is what we need to get that shallow depth of field in video, but it's going to be so bright that you need something in front of the lens to lower the amount of light going into the camera. So that's what the variable ND filter is for. It's basically like variable strength sunglasses. So with this now on the front, I can spin this element back and forth and it'll increase or decrease the amount of blockage that it's getting into the lens. So this is a game changer, and I think this thing alone is what separates out the amateur stuff from the professional stuff that I've seen online. Even if you're shooting on an older camera, maybe it's an old Canon T2i or an old Nikon or anything, having an ND filter in front of your lens is what takes the footage looking pretty amateur, I think, to the next level, especially if you're filming a lot of motion. If you're filming something that's static, perhaps it's an interview, you probably won't notice the effects of the ND filter that much. It really comes down to the fact when there's motion, a lot of motion in the frame. I actually even bought ND filters for my drone and for my GoPro, and I think putting those on the front really takes the footage to the next level. It's little nitpicky stuff, and I think we're definitely getting to the point where it's a little bit more effort to do this stuff, but if you want to take your video quality and take it to the next level, these are some of the things that'll do that. If you guys didn't know, I made 4 other videos while here in Canada covering techniques in photography and filmmaking, and I think they're really useful tips and tricks that'll help you guys up your photography and video game a lot. So if you haven't seen those, go check them out, and thanks for watching.